In this episode, we move into a part of the Certified Information Systems Auditor, CISA, journey that often feels intimidating at first because it seems full of legal language, formal expectations, and documents that sound far removed from everyday technology work. The good news is that beginners do not need to become attorneys to understand what this topic is really about. At its core, this area teaches you how organizations are expected to manage information technology, IT, in a way that respects legal obligations, follows required rules, and aligns with widely accepted good practices. When a company collects data, processes payments, supports employees, serves customers, or operates in regulated markets, it cannot simply decide that technology choices are private internal matters. Laws, regulations, and standards shape what the organization must protect, what it must report, how it must behave, and how leaders should prove that responsibilities are being taken seriously. Once you see these sources of expectation as part of the environment around IT rather than as disconnected documents, the topic becomes much easier to understand. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first concept to get clear is that laws, regulations, and industry standards are related, but they are not the same thing. A law is a requirement created through a legislative process, and violating it can lead to serious legal consequences such as penalties, lawsuits, or government enforcement actions. A regulation is usually a more specific rule issued by a regulatory body that has authority over a particular sector or activity, and it explains how legal requirements are applied in practice. An industry standard is different because it often reflects accepted good practice or a recognized benchmark rather than a direct legal command. Although in some situations standards become effectively mandatory because contracts, regulators, or customer expectations require them. This distinction matters in auditing because you need to understand the source of the requirement before you can judge how the organization should respond. A team might treat everything as a best effort suggestion, but that attitude becomes dangerous when a requirement is actually enforceable and failure to comply can affect operations, reputation, and legal standing. It helps to think about this through a simple, everyday analogy. Traffic laws tell drivers what they must do, such as stopping at red lights or staying within speed limits, while detailed road regulations may define how vehicles are inspected, licensed, or operated under specific conditions. At the same time, there may be recommended safety practices that are not always written into law but are still widely accepted as smart and responsible, such as checking mirrors carefully, maintaining proper following distance, or using certain safety features. Organizations face a similar environment in IT, where some expectations are non-negotiable, some are enforced through regulators, and some come from accepted practice that mature organizations are still expected to follow. An auditor is not satisfied just because management says the team is trying its best. The more important question is whether leaders know which obligations are truly mandatory, which ones guide good design, and how all of them affect systems, processes, and controls. Why does this matter so much in the management of IT domain rather than only in legal or compliance departments? The answer is that technology now touches nearly every regulated activity inside an organization, from financial reporting and payroll to customer records, health information, contracts, communications, and business continuity. If management makes poor decisions about systems, data handling, access control, retention, monitoring, or incident response, the organization can break rules without ever intending to do so. A legal requirement may not mention a specific server or application by name, but the practical effect of the requirement still lands on technology teams and business leaders who depend on technology. This is why good IT management includes understanding external obligations early rather than discovering them during a crisis, an audit finding, or a regulatory investigation. Strong organizations do not wait until they are accused of noncompliance before asking what rules apply. They build awareness into planning, governance, policy, and oversight from the start. Another key beginner insight is that not every law or regulation applies to every organization in the same way. What matters depends on factors such as industry, geography, customer type, data type, contractual commitments, and business activities. A hospital, a bank, a retailer, a manufacturer, and a university may all use similar technologies, but they often face different legal and regulatory expectations because of what they do and what information they handle. Even the same company can face multiple overlapping requirements if it operates in more than one country, serves government customers, handles payment card data, or stores personal information from different jurisdictions. This is one reason management of IT cannot rely on assumptions or guesswork. Leaders need a clear process to identify applicable requirements, understand where they come from, and determine which systems, vendors, processes, and datasets fall within scope. Without that clarity, teams may over-control areas that do not need it while overlooking obligations that are actually critical. Personal data offers one of the clearest examples of how legal and regulatory expectations shape IT decisions. Many organizations collect names, addresses, contact details, payment information, account records, employee information, and behavioral data as part of normal operations. Once that information exists, laws or regulations may control how it is collected, used, shared, stored, protected, retained, and deleted. Some rules emphasize transparency and notice, some focus on consent and lawful use, and others emphasize security, breach reporting, or data subject rights. The important lesson for a beginner is not memorizing every possible rule from every region. It is understanding that information management choices are never purely technical or purely convenient. A system design that makes perfect sense for speed or marketing value may still create legal exposure if it keeps data too long, shares it too widely, or fails to protect it appropriately. That is why auditors look for evidence that data handling practices match the obligations that apply. Financial reporting and record integrity provide another useful lens, especially because many organizations depend on IT to process transactions, calculate balances, approve changes, and preserve evidence of business activity. When systems influence financial statements or important business records, laws and regulations may require stronger controls over access, change management, segregation of duties, logging, and retention. If those controls are weak, the issue is not just technical unreliability. It can become a compliance problem, a governance problem, and in severe cases, a legal problem. This connection is important because beginners sometimes imagine compliance as something separate from operations, as if a compliance team checks boxes after the real work is done. In reality, technology decisions often determine whether compliance is even possible. A poorly designed process can make it difficult to prove who approved a transaction, who changed a record, or whether a system was operating as intended during a critical period. Good management understands that evidence and control reliability matter as much as raw functionality. Industry standards enter the picture because organizations often need more guidance than laws and regulations provide on their own. A law may say that sensitive information must be protected, but it may not tell an organization exactly how to build a mature control environment or how to structure governance over IT risk. Standards help fill that gap by offering recognized frameworks, principles, and control expectations that organizations can use to design more consistent and defensible practices. Some standards are broad and strategic, while others focus on specific subjects such as service management, information security, quality, or payment environments. Even when a standard is not legally mandatory, following it can still be highly valuable because it shows discipline, supports consistency, and gives auditors a benchmark for evaluating whether management is using accepted good practice. A standard can also create a common language so that leadership, technology teams, auditors, and outside partners are not all using different definitions of what good control looks like. It is also important to understand that compliance does not automatically mean security, and security does not automatically mean compliance. These ideas overlap, but they are not identical. An organization can technically satisfy a narrow requirement on paper while still leaving major weaknesses unaddressed because it focused only on minimum obligations rather than actual risk. The reverse can also happen, where a technically strong team implements useful controls but fails compliance because documentation, approvals, reporting, or evidence retention do not meet the required standard. This distinction appears often in audit thinking because the goal is not just to praise activity. The goal is to determine whether controls are appropriate, reliable, and aligned with both risk and obligation. Mature management recognizes that compliance should support disciplined operations, not replace thoughtful risk management. When teams treat compliance as a finish line instead of a baseline, they often miss the broader control environment that laws, regulations, and standards are meant to encourage. Because of that, management must translate external requirements into internal action. That translation usually happens through governance decisions, policies, standards, procedures, training, monitoring, and accountability. A law does not usually reach into a company and rewrite its access review process directly. Instead, leaders and managers must interpret the requirement, determine what it means for the organization, assign responsibility, and ensure that business units, technology teams, and vendors follow the resulting expectations consistently. This is where weak management becomes especially dangerous. If legal, compliance, security, and operational teams all understand the requirement differently, the organization may create gaps without realizing it. One group may believe a control is operating, another may think it is optional, and a third may assume a vendor is handling it. Auditors often uncover these disconnects not because nobody cared, but because management failed to turn outside obligations into clear internal responsibilities and measurable operating practices. Vendors and third parties make this subject even more important because organizations rarely operate technology environments entirely on their own anymore. They may rely on cloud providers, payroll companies, software vendors, managed service providers, consultants, payment processors, and data hosting partners. Even when a vendor performs the service, the organization usually remains responsible for making sure legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements are met. That means management must understand which obligations can be shared, which can never be delegated away, and what evidence is needed to show that third-party controls are adequate. Beginners sometimes assume that buying a service transfers the problem, but auditors know that outsourcing a function does not outsource accountability. Strong IT management includes due diligence, contract review, monitoring, right-to-audit considerations, and a clear understanding of which systems or data sets are subject to external requirements. A weak vendor relationship can create hidden compliance exposure that becomes visible only after an incident, an audit, or a customer complaint. Geography also matters more than many new learners expect. Technology can move data quickly across borders, but legal obligations do not disappear just because systems are distributed, cloud-based, or centrally managed. Different countries and regions may define personal information differently, require different breach notification timelines, impose different limits on retention or transfer, or expect different protections for employees and customers. A global organization may therefore need to map obligations carefully instead of applying one simple rule everywhere and hoping it covers everything. At the same time, overcomplicating the environment can create its own problems if no one knows which standard or law governs a given process. This is why clear scoping, data classification, and ownership are so valuable. Auditors look for evidence that management understands where data lives, where it flows, who controls it, and which obligations apply at each important point. Without that visibility, compliance efforts can become superficial and unreliable. A very common misconception is that this topic is mostly about memorizing famous laws and naming large frameworks in exam questions. There is some vocabulary involved, of course, but the deeper learning goal is to understand how external expectations shape internal control decisions. If you remember only titles and acronyms, you may struggle when a question asks what management should do first, who should be accountable, or why a control weakness matters in a regulated environment. The stronger approach is to keep asking practical questions. What obligation applies here? How is it identified? How is it translated into policy or control? Who owns it? How is compliance monitored? And what evidence shows it is really happening? That way of thinking works even when a question mentions a law you know well, a regulation you know only generally, or an industry standard you have seen only in a broad sense. Audit reasoning is usually less about trivia and more about control logic. As you continue through Domain 2, Remember that laws, regulations, and industry standards are not side topics sitting outside the management of IT conversation. They are part of the environment that tells organizations what responsible technology management must account for in the real world. Good leaders identify applicable obligations early, understand the difference between mandatory requirements and good practice, convert outside expectations into internal controls, and monitor whether those controls are working as intended. Poor leaders treat compliance as somebody else's problem, assume vendors will handle everything, or wait until a finding exposes the gap. From an audit perspective, the strongest organizations are rarely the ones with the most impressive slogans. They are the ones that can show a clear line from external requirement to internal governance, operational control, accountable ownership, and reliable evidence. When you see that chain clearly, this domain becomes far less abstract and much more practical for both the exam and real organizational life.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.